Right now, deep in the frozen heart of the Siberian wilderness, a freight train stretching over 2 kilometers in length rolls slowly through an endless ocean of black timber in the middle of the night. Outside the locomotive windows, the temperature gauge hovers at a bone-chilling -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The nearest human settlement is over 200 kilometers behind them, fading into the dark horizon. There is no highway running alongside these tracks. No cellular signal, no streetlights, and no artificial glow of any kind for 100 miles. There is only a vast, silent wilderness of frozen pine and larch trees, stretching further in every direction than most people can truly comprehend. And at the front of that mass of rolling steel, inside one small heated locomotive cab, sit the only human beings within 100 kilometers, a two-man train crew. A full crossing of this remote rail sector takes 3 long days and 3 nights. For almost every minute of that journey, the two men inside that cab are entirely on their own. They are not solitary in the traditional sense, because Russian Arctic freight trains are strictly operated by a crew of 2, a senior locomotive driver and his assistant. But make no mistake, they are alone in a far more dangerous way. If something snaps, breaks, or fails out here tonight, nobody is coming to save them anytime soon. There is no heavy recovery vehicle that can drive into this forest, no mobile repair unit, and not a single warm building within walking distance. There is only the driver, his assistant, 6,000 tons of frozen steel, and a Siberian forest that has not seen a temperature above -40 degrees Fahrenheit in over 3 weeks. So, how does anyone actually survive this job? How do you cook meals, sleep, stay warm, and keep thousands of tons of heavy industrial freight crawling across the coldest inhabited region on planet Earth? Step inside the cab with us, because almost nothing about operating a heavy freight locomotive in the deep Arctic works the way you would expect. Welcome to our channel, where we explore the incredible engineering, survival wisdom, and forgotten history of humanity's most extreme frontier operations. Before we head further down the line into the frozen dark, take a moment to drop a comment below and let us know what city, state, or country you are tuning in from today. And if you appreciate deep-dive historical documentaries on human survival and mechanical grit, hit that subscribe button to join our growing community. To understand how a train crew survives 3 days in the deep taiga, you first have to understand what -40 degrees Fahrenheit does to the railway line itself. Out here in the deep winter, the freezing cold does not just hunt the human body. It actively hunts the machinery, and it hunts the heavy steel tracks beneath the locomotive wheels. Let us start with the rails themselves. Under normal summer weather, railway steel is remarkably resilient and flexible, expanding and flexing harmlessly beneath the immense weight of passing freight traffic. But when extreme Arctic cold sets in, steel loses its elasticity. Metal that once bent under pressure becomes dangerously brittle in hard winter. When temperatures plummet past -30 degrees Fahrenheit, carbon steel rail undergoes a physical transformation known as a ductile to brittle transition. Instead of absorbing heavy vibration, the rail becomes as rigid as glass. Under the crushing impact of a fully loaded freight train moving at speed, a brittle rail will not bend. It will crack, shatter, or snap cleanly in two. A fractured rail beneath a 6,000-ton freight train moving through pitch darkness is about as catastrophic an emergency as railroading gets. A single broken rail can flip a 3-section diesel locomotive and pile up dozens of heavy tank cars into a tangled mountain of twisted metal in a matter of seconds. Therefore, when the deep Arctic freeze locks in across Siberia, the entire railway system fundamentally alters its operational behavior. Trains slow down dramatically. Strict speed restrictions appear across entire divisions. Drivers learn to read the iron line ahead with entirely different eyes, scanning for subtle variations in the darkness. And scattered along thousands of kilometers of track, living in isolated timber huts buried in snowdrifts, are the forgotten guardians of the railway line, the track walkers, known in Russian as obkodchiki. These men and women perform what might be one of the loneliest and most dangerous jobs on the face of the earth. Their entire existence revolves around walking assigned sections of remote track on foot in pitch darkness, carrying heavy iron lanterns and inspection hammers. As they walk along the frozen ties, in air so severe that exposed skin freezes solid in under 4 minutes, they tap the side of the steel rails with their hammers. A healthy, solid rail responds to a hammer strike with a clear, high-pitched ringing chime that echoes through the quiet forest. But a rail containing an internal micro-crack or invisible fracture produces a dull, muffled thud. By sound and eye alone, these lone inspectors spot invisible flaws in the steel before a multi-thousand-ton freight train comes roaring through the night. Outside of rural Russia, almost no one in the modern world has ever heard of these track walkers. Yet, the survival of every train crossing the continent depends entirely on their silent, frozen foot patrols. Then comes the locomotive itself. And here is a startling mechanical truth that surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. Through the deep winter months on the remote diesel-powered sectors of the northern network, these heavy locomotive engines are practically never shut down. They do not turn off the engines while waiting at remote sidings. They do not turn them off during crew shift changes, and they do not turn them off even when parked in an open yard for 12 or 16 hours. The massive V12 and V16 diesel engines run continuously for months at a time. The mechanical reason for this continuous idling is simple, straightforward, and slightly terrifying. At minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, a heavy industrial diesel engine that goes cold will refuse to start up again. Truth be told, bringing a cold diesel back to life in those temperatures can require a full day of desperate, dangerous work using external flame heaters and industrial heat blowers. When an engine shuts down in extreme cold, the thick diesel engine oil loses its viscosity and thickens into a dark, jelly-like sludge that cannot be pumped through the engine bearings. The diesel fuel itself begins to wax, forming paraffin crystals that instantly clog fuel filters and injectors. Worst of all, any water present in the liquid cooling system will freeze solid, expanding with tremendous force and splitting the thick cast-iron engine block open like a glass bottle left too long in a deep freezer. So, all winter long, across railway yards and isolated forest sidings stretching from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific coastline, there is a low-frequency sound that never stops. The deep, patient, heavy rumble of thousands of horsepower idling through the dark winter months. In the Arctic wilderness, cutting a locomotive engine does not conserve fuel. It executes the locomotive. Inside the cab, that continuously running engine is also the single piece of technology keeping the train crew alive. The main engine feeds electrical power and hot coolant to heavy-duty cab heaters that maintain their small iron room at a livable 65 degrees Fahrenheit, even while thick white frost creeps several inches up the inside edges of the cab glass. Locomotive drivers who have spent decades working these northern routes describe the winter cab in the exact same way. A tiny, warm floating island sliding through hundreds of miles of air that would kill an unprotected human being in less than an hour. The crews provision that tiny warm island with the exact same meticulous care that 18th century sailors used when outfitting an ocean-going vessel for a long voyage into uncharted waters. Because when you strip away the modern technology, that is genuinely what an Arctic freight run is, a voyage across an inland ocean of ice and snow. Food for several days is packed tightly into metal storage lockers inside the cab. They stock heavy rounds of dark rye bread, tinned pork, cured pork fat known as salo, dried sausages, instant noodles, and tea. Always tea. On the northern rail lines, hot black tea is not merely a comforting beverage. It is practically part of the standard operating manual. A heavy metal kettle or compact electric stove is bolted down inside the cab to boil water around the clock. In addition to food, heavy Arctic survival gear is stowed within arm's reach of the crew seats. This includes thick sheepskin coats, heavy felt boots known as valenki, insulated fur hats, and heavy leather mittens lined with wool, layered over work gloves. Even though every crew member prays he will never have to step outside into the night for longer than a few seconds, the gear is always ready. If an air hose breaks or a mechanical coupling jams between cars, a crew member must step out into the freezing wind to perform repairs by hand. Along with their winter gear, the cab carries a complete mechanical toolkit, heavy pry bars, kerosene lanterns, flare kits, and one unwritten commandment that is drilled into every young railway worker from his very first winter run. No matter what happens out on the line, you do not leave the train. The locomotive has heat. The locomotive has hundreds of gallons of fuel. The locomotive has heavy iron walls and a high-powered radio transmitter. The dark forest, stretching out in every direction for 200 miles, has none of those things. Stepping away from the train into a snowdrift during a blizzard at -40 degrees Fahrenheit is the fastest way to disappear forever. Sleep and shift work on these multi-day wilderness crossings operate under a strict, traditional discipline. On a long-haul route, the two men in the cab rotate control of the heavy train in continuous shifts. The man on duty sits in the elevated driver's seat, staring out into the narrow tunnel of light created by the locomotive's high-intensity headlight. His eyes constantly scan the track ahead, looking for fallen trees, snowdrifts, or track distortions. As the driver operates the heavy controls, he observes a strict railway communication protocol born in the early 20th century. Every time the train approaches a signal light, a speed marker, or a track switch, the driver must speak the status of the signal out loud into the cab. His assistant must immediately repeat the exact same command back to him in a clear voice. "Signal green, track clear, speed 40, the driver announces. "Signal green, track clear, speed 40, the assistant confirms. This continuous verbal call-and-response discipline ensures that neither man falls into a hypnotic trance while staring into the endless hypnotic swirling of snow falling through the headlight beam. While one man drives, the off-duty crew member rests directly behind him on a narrow, fold-down metal bunk mounted against the back wall of the cab. Beneath his head, the deep, heavy thud of the multi-ton diesel engine vibrates through the steel frame like an enormous, steady pulse. Drivers who have spent 30 years on these remote lines describe that intense engine vibration as producing some of the deepest, most peaceful sleep of their lives. The heavy rumble of the diesel acts as a perfect white noise machine, blocking out the howling of the Arctic wind outside. The rhythmic, mechanical clatter of the heavy steel wheels passing over the track joints, that steady, endless sound rocks the entire heavy cab like a massive iron cradle. There are no ringing cellular phones out here, no traffic noise, and no distractions. There is only warmth, rhythmic motion, and the quiet, comforting knowledge that your partner is sitting wide awake at the controls just 10 feet away from your boots. When the train eventually reaches a major division point or crew change station far down the line, a fresh, well-rested crew climbs the frozen iron ladder into the cab. The tired driver and assistant pack up their gear, step down onto the snow-covered platform, and head toward a heated railway dormitory to get 8 hours of deep sleep in a real bed. But the train itself does not stop. The new crew takes over the controls, checks the air pressure gauges, releases the heavy train brakes, and notch the throttle forward once again. Across the vast northern wilderness in the dead of winter, the men rotate continuously, but the train itself keeps rolling day and night. Here's the thing about this massive transport operation. The crews out on the main line are not entirely alone, even if it feels that way in the middle of the night. Behind the scenes, the railway network fights winter, with an army of specialized winter machinery that most people in the Western world have never laid eyes on. When heavy winter blizzards bury the tracks under 4 feet of dense snow, the railway dispatches massive snow-clearing trains equipped with giant rotary plows. These specialized locomotives feature enormous spinning steel blades mounted on the front that chew through rock-solid snowdrifts and hurl white walls of powder 60 feet away from the tracks. At major junction points, maintenance teams work around the clock using specialized gas heaters and electric heating elements built directly into the track switches. In extreme sub-zero weather, ice and packed snow can jam between the movable steel switch rails, preventing trains from changing tracks. A single frozen switch can paralyze traffic across an entire rail corridor, stranding dozens of freight trains in the wilderness. In the heavy division yards, workers move slowly between frozen rail cars throughout the night, using long-handled hammers to test air brake linkages and spraying specialized anti-freeze compounds on mechanical couplings to prevent them from locking up solid. During the long winter months, this northern railway system ceases to be mere transportation infrastructure. It becomes an active battlefront, staffed 24 hours a day by thousands of dedicated men and women working in conditions that would paralyze most modern cities. Stay with me, because what happens when a train suffers a mechanical failure in the middle of a remote 200-kilometer wilderness gap reveals the terrifyingly thin line between a routine delay and a life-threatening emergency. Think about what a minor mechanical hiccup means on an ordinary railway line in mild weather. A broken rubber seal, a frozen air valve somewhere along 2 kilometers of freight cars, or a faulty electrical heater inside the cab. On a standard railroad, these issues are minor annoyances that cause a 1-hour delay. You pick up a radio, call dispatch, and wait for a service truck to drive up on a nearby road with spare parts and hot coffee. Out here at minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 200 kilometers from the nearest town, with no roads for 100 miles, every small mechanical failure carries the exact same silent, deadly question beneath it. Can you find and fix this problem before the engine cools down and the cold converts a routine repair into a fight for survival? Consider the train's air brake system, which is the absolute lifeblood of heavy freight railroading. A 2-kilometer-long freight train relies on compressed air pumped from the locomotive all the way to the very last car to operate its heavy mechanical brakes. As that compressed air travels down thousands of feet of iron piping beneath the cars, tiny amounts of atmospheric moisture inside the pipes can condense. In normal weather, this moisture drains harmlessly away, but at minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, that moisture freezes instantly into sharp ice crystals. If those ice crystals accumulate inside an airline valve halfway down the train, they form a solid plug of ice. Suddenly, the driver in the cab notices his air pressure gauge dropping rapidly. The heavy brakes on the back half of the train lock up solid, bringing thousands of tons of rolling freight to a grinding, shuddering halt in the middle of the dark forest. When this happens, the assistant driver must put on his heavy fur coat, pull his sheepskin cap down over his ears, grab an iron inspection tool and a portable blowtorch, and step out of the warm cab into the howling black darkness. Walking along the side of a 2-kilometer train parked on an embankment in 3 feet of powdery snow is an exhausting, brutal ordeal. The wind coming off the open forest stings any exposed skin like sharp needles. The assistant driver must trudge past dozens of heavy rail cars, inspecting every brake cylinder and iron pipe connections under the dim beam of his flashlight, searching for the exact frozen valve that stopped the train. When he finds the frozen pipe, he must carefully ignite his portable blowtorch, holding the blue flame against the iron valve to melt the internal block of ice, all while making sure his heavy winter gloves do not freeze to the bare metal frame of the railcar. Touch bare metal with an unprotected hand at minus 40 degrees, and your skin will instantly freeze and weld itself to the iron. This extreme environment is precisely why Russian freight locomotives always carry a 2-man crew. One man must stay inside the cab to monitor the main engine, keep the cab warm, and maintain radio contact, while the other man battles the frozen elements outside. It is a system built entirely on absolute trust, mechanical self-reliance, and relentless discipline. When you speak to veteran train drivers who have spent 30 or 40 years operating freight locomotives across these northern wilderness sectors, something fascinating happens. When asked about the brutal hardship of the job, the freezing temperatures, and the constant danger, they rarely dwell on the extreme cold. Instead, they talk about the breathtaking, terrifying beauty of the wilderness. They speak about coming around a wide, sweeping mountain curve at 4 o'clock in the morning just as the winter sun begins to rise, looking back in the side mirror to see 2 kilometers of heavy steel cars trailing behind them through the snow. They describe watching the frozen taiga forest turn brilliant shades of pink and gold under fresh, untouched snow, knowing with absolute certainty that no other human being on Earth is witnessing that exact view at that moment. They talk about cold, crystal-clear nights, when the northern lights bloom across the dark sky in shimmering curtains of neon green and emerald, burning so bright above the lonely rail line that the snow drifts on either side of the track glow with a surreal green light. And they speak about the profound, absolute silence that envelops the locomotive when it pauses at a tiny, abandoned forest siding to wait for an oncoming train to pass. It is the exact same deep, Arctic quiet, described by long-haul ice road truckers in northern Canada, a heavy, peaceful silence, where fresh, soft snowfall swallows every vibration on Earth, leaving only the steady, rhythmic breathing of the idling diesel engine far below the floorboards. One retired senior locomotive driver from the Lake Baikal region once shared a thought about his career that captures the true spirit of this extreme profession. He said, "When I am at home in the city, I am just one old man walking among millions of people in crowded streets, completely invisible. But when I am out on the main line at 3 o'clock in the morning in the middle of winter, my locomotive headlight is the only light moving through 1,000 kilometers of pitch darkness. Tell me which one of those places makes a man feel lonely." To understand how heavy transport survives in the frozen wilderness, you have to look beyond the locomotive cab and examine the extreme engineering built into every single mile of the Arctic rail line itself. Western railroad engineers in the late 19th and mid-20th centuries often declared that building a heavy, high-capacity freight railroad across the Siberian wilderness was physically impossible. They looked at the endless miles of permafrost, the swampy summer terrain, and the extreme winter temperatures, and they insisted that no iron track could ever remain stable under those conditions. They called the early pioneer builders crazy. Traditional civil engineering rules suggested that laying heavy iron rails over frozen soil would lead to instant structural failure. And in the early days, the skeptics appeared to be entirely correct. When engineers first attempted to lay tracks across the northern interior, they encountered a relentless natural phenomenon known as thermokarst. Siberian permafrost is not merely frozen dirt. It is a dense, rock-hard mixture of soil, gravel, and massive underground ice sheets that have remained frozen for tens of thousands of years. In the dead of winter, this ground is as solid as granite. But when summer arrives, the top layer of soil thaws into a soupy, bottomless mud swamp. Worse still, when heavy dark iron rails and gravel ballast were laid directly onto the tundra, the black metal absorbed radiant heat from the summer sun. That heat transferred straight down into the ground, melting the ancient ice beneath the tracks. Entire sections of railway embankment dissolved into liquid mud, causing heavy iron rails to twist like pretzels and sinking steam locomotives up to their wheel axles. During the deep winter, an equally destructive force took over: frost heaving. As moisture inside the upper soil froze, it expanded with immense hydraulic pressure, pushing the heavy wooden ties upward by several inches in random spots. A train running across tracks, damaged by frost heaving, would sway violently, snapping wheel axles and throwing loaded cars into the forest. The solution that Russian railway engineers eventually developed was a masterclass in vernacular cold-weather engineering. Rather than fighting the frozen ground, they realized they had to preserve it. The goal was not to thaw the permafrost, but to freeze it permanently in place, keeping it as solid as concrete all year round. To achieve this, engineers constructed massive raised railway embankments built from thick layers of coarse, dry rock ballast and volcanic gravel. This heavy rock layer acted as a thermal blanket, insulating the subterranean ice sheets from the summer heat. Along the most extreme permafrost sectors, builders implemented a brilliant piece of passive refrigeration technology: thermosiphons. These are long, hollow steel pipes filled with liquid ammonia or carbon dioxide, driven deep into the railway embankment alongside the tracks. During the freezing winter months, heat from the deep ground rises into the liquid ammonia inside the pipe. The ammonia boils into a gas, rises to the top of the pipe above the snow line, cools down in the sub-zero Arctic air, condenses back into a liquid, and rains back down to the bottom of the tube. This continuous, self-powered thermodynamic cycle actively pumps heat out of the ground and radiates it into the frozen sky, chilling the soil beneath the tracks to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. When summer arrives, the fluid inside the sealed pipe simply stops circulating, leaving the ground frozen rock-hard underneath the heavy freight line. The physics were simple, completely self-regulating, and required zero electrical power or moving mechanical parts. Mind you, The structural engineering of the locomotives operating on these lines had to be redesigned just as radically to withstand the northern climate. Standard freight engines manufactured for mild European or North American climates quickly broke down when exposed to prolonged sub-zero weather. Consider the mechanical anatomy of a heavy Siberian diesel-electric locomotive, such as the legendary double-section heavy freight engines designed specifically for Arctic service. These machines are massive, rugged, industrial beasts, weighing over 250 tons and generating thousands of horsepower. But every critical fluid system inside these locomotives had to be re-engineered from the ground up to prevent the cold from destroying them. Here's the thing about diesel fuel at extreme low temperatures. Standard diesel begins to change state long before it reaches minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, wax paraffin compounds, naturally dissolved inside the fuel, begin to crystallize and separate from the liquid. This process is known in mechanical engineering as the wax cloud point. As the temperature drops further towards zero, these paraffin wax crystals bond together, turning clear liquid diesel into a thick, cloudy gel that resembles petroleum jelly. If a locomotive engine tries to draw waxed fuel from its tanks, those soft paraffin crystals instantly coat the fine mesh of the fuel filters, starving the engine of fuel and shutting it down completely within minutes. To combat fuel gelling, Arctic freight locomotives feature complex internal heat exchange networks. Heavy copper hot water coils, carrying hot coolant directly from the running engine block, are routed through the interior of the main diesel fuel tanks. This closed-loop thermal circuit warms the thousands of gallons of onboard diesel fuel, keeping the liquid held at a comfortable 70 degrees Fahrenheit inside the tank, even while the outside air sits at 40 degrees below zero. As long as the engine remains running, it continually heats its own fuel supply. But if the engine ever stops for an extended period, the thermal loop collapses, the fuel gelation process begins, and the locomotive is rendered completely inert. An equally critical engineering challenge was the locomotive's compressed air system. Heavy freight trains rely entirely on pneumatic pressure to control their braking systems. Heavy air compressors mounted on the engine draw in vast quantities of outside atmospheric air, compress it to high pressure, and pump it through iron brake lines running the entire length of the 2-kilometer train. However, outside air always contains microscopic water vapor. When that air is compressed inside the locomotive tanks, the moisture condenses into liquid water droplets. In a warm climate, this water simply drains out through automatic bleed valves. But at minus 40 degrees, that liquid water freezes instantly as it enters the brake pipes under the uninsulated rail cars. If ice crystals block a brake pipe, the driver loses the ability to control the brakes on the cars behind the blockage. A heavy freight train, moving down a 2% mountain grade with frozen brake lines, becomes an unstoppable 60-mile-per-hour missile of heavy steel. To prevent this fatal scenario, Arctic locomotives utilize specialized dual-stage air desiccant towers and liquid alcohol injection systems. Before compressed air is allowed to enter the main train line, it passes through heavy desiccant chambers packed with moisture-absorbing chemical beads. During extreme cold snaps, an automated system injects fine vapors of pure methyl alcohol directly into the air streams. The alcohol mixes with any remaining water droplets, lowering the freezing point of the liquid to far below minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. This prevents ice crystals from ever forming inside the tiny valves and iron brake hoses dangling beneath the freight cars. Inside the locomotive cab itself, thermal insulation design is the absolute key to human survival. The heavy iron walls of a standard locomotive cab act as giant thermal conductors, rapidly transferring interior heat straight out into the freezing wilderness. High-speed travel amplifies this problem exponentially. When a train moves forward at 40 miles per hour into a 30-mile-per-hour headwind, the effective wind chill stripping heat away from the cab outer shell becomes utterly ferocious. To protect the crew from this relentless forced air convection, Arctic cabs are constructed like heavy winter thermoses. The outer steel shell of the cab is lined with a 4-inch thick layer of high-density mineral wool insulation, followed by a vapor barrier membrane and an inner wood composite paneling. The cab windows are built using thick, double-glazed vacuum pane glass, treated with internal heating wires to prevent heavy frost buildup from blinding the driver. Heavy rubber gaskets seal every door seam and control cable port to prevent icy pressurized air drafts from shooting into the cab. Heat inside the cab is generated by a multi-layered, redundant system. Primary heat comes from heavy radiator heat exchangers connected directly to the engine cooling system. Secondary heat is provided by high-capacity electric heating coils powered by the locomotive's auxiliary electrical generator. And on older or long-haul wilderness, locomotives operating in the most isolated sectors, engineers installed an ultimate, low-tech backup safety system, an independent, heavy cast-iron coal or wood-burning stove, known locally as a burjuka, mounted directly in the auxiliary cab section behind the driver's seat. If an electrical failure or generator breakdown disables the modern heating units in the dead of winter, the crew can manually light the cast-iron stove using dry timber and coal carried in emergency lockers. The smoke is vented out through a dedicated steel chimney pipe running through the roof. This simple iron stove ensures that even if the locomotive suffers a total electrical collapse, the two men inside will not freeze to death while waiting for help to arrive. If you are enjoying this deep dive into extreme Arctic mechanics and survival history, take a moment right now to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We publish long-form documentaries, uncovering the incredible physics, forgotten history, and engineering grit behind humanity's most extraordinary frontier machinery. Subscribing helps us bring you more of these in-depth stories every single week. While the locomotive cab provides a mobile shelter, the railway network also relies on a hidden network of stationary survival infrastructure scattered along the Iron Line, the track walker section huts, every 10 to 15 kilometers along the remote northern rail corridors. Standing alone amidst the deep snowdrifts of the taiga, sits a small, rugged wooden or stone cabin. These small structures are the permanent posts for the track walkers who patrol the line. The architectural design of these section huts reflects centuries of traditional Siberian winter building wisdom. They are intentionally built small, with low ceilings and compact footprints. The math behind this compact design is simple. A small interior volume requires significantly less thermal energy to heat, allowing a single small stove to keep the interior warm even during prolonged Arctic blizzards. The exterior walls are built from thick, hand-notched larch logs or heavy field stones stacked double thick. The gaps between the logs are packed tightly with dried forest moss and tarred hemp rope, creating an airtight seal that prevents winter winds from penetrating the timber. The roof is heavily insulated with layers of dry birch bark, dirt, and heavy sod, which acts as a natural thermal blanket. During the dead of winter, deep snow accumulates on top of the low roof, adding several feet of natural insulation that traps heat inside the building. Crucially, every section hut features a double-door entrance vestibule, known as a sini. This functions as a natural thermal airlock. When a track walker returns from a freezing 4-hour patrol in the dark, he opens the outer door, steps into the unheated vestibule, and closes the outer door completely before opening the inner door into the main living room. This simple 2-door buffer system prevents massive bursts of sub-zero Arctic air from rushing into the warm cabin and stripping away the stored heat every time someone enters or exits. Inside the section hut, the centerpiece of survival is the traditional masonry stove. Built from heavy firebrick and clay, this massive stove operates on the principle of thermal mass storage. When a track walker builds a wood fire inside the stove's firebox, the hot exhaust smoke does not vent straight up a chimney. Instead, the intense heat is forced to travel through a winding, serpentine network of internal brick flues before reaching the outside air. As the hot gas travels through these internal brick channels, the heavy fire bricks absorb nearly all of the thermal energy, holding onto that heat long after the wood fire has burned down to cold ashes. A masonry stove fired up for just 2 hours in the morning will continuously radiate gentle, life-saving heat into the cabin for the next 18 hours. These isolated section huts are fully stocked with long-term survival supplies. Dry firewood stacked high in the entryway, barrels of clean drinking water, heavy iron cooking pots, dried grain, salt, tinned meats, emergency kerosene lamps, and a direct-wired telegraph or magneto hand-crank railway telephone line connected directly to the nearest station master's office. If an Arctic blizzard hits the region with zero visibility whiteout conditions, making track patrols impossible, the track walker retreats into his section hut, secures the heavy door latches, and relies on the thermal mass of his brick stove to ride out the storm. Word spread faster than the cold wind among early railroaders that survival in these remote huts required absolute discipline. Every track walker was bound by an unwritten frontier law: never leave a section hut without restocking the firewood box for the next person who might seek shelter there. A lone track inspector or stranded train crew member, stumbling out of a blizzard into an unheated section hut with no dry wood available, could easily perish before getting a fire started. Therefore, dry birch logs and dry kindling were always split, stacked, and kept bone dry right next to the masonry stove, ready to be lit with a single match. The mechanical synergy between these stationary survival huts, the continuous foot patrols of the track walkers, and the specialized heavy locomotives formed a human and engineering defense line against one of the most hostile winter environments on Earth. Every component of the system, from the liquid ammonia thermosiphons stabilizing the frozen ground below, to the alcohol evaporators keeping the train brake lines clear, to the massive masonry stoves glowing inside the isolated timber cabins, was designed around one cold, undeniable reality. Down here at minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, mechanical systems do not get second chances. As it turned out, the true test of this entire complex network of men and machines did not happen on an ordinary winter night. It occurred during the historic Arctic blizzards that periodically sweep across the Siberian interior, when temperatures collapse to unthinkable lows and ferocious Arctic gales threaten to paralyze every. It was the bitter winter of 1979 when one of the most severe Arctic blizzards of the 20th century descended upon the northern rail corridors of the Siberian interior. Across a vast territory stretching thousands of square miles, an Arctic high-pressure system collided with a polar storm front, causing temperatures to collapse from a manageable minus 30 degrees to an astonishing minus 52 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 6 hours. To make matters worse, gale-force Arctic winds whipped through the mountain passes at over 60 miles per hour, creating complete whiteout blizzard conditions. Visibility dropped to absolute zero. The snow drifting off the open tundra was so dense and fine that it penetrated every crevice, looking like white smoke swirling through the pitch-black night. Deep within a 200-kilometer wilderness gap between isolated mountain stations, a heavy freight train carrying over 8,000 tons of vital coal, timber, and winter diesel fuel was crawling slowly through the storm. At the controls of the heavy 3-section diesel locomotive was a veteran driver named Victor and his young assistant, Andre. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the storm outside the locomotive windows had reached a terrifying crescendo. The Arctic wind roared around the iron cab with a high-pitched scream, and the temperature gauge inside the engine room was dropping steadily despite the heaters running at maximum capacity. Out ahead of the locomotive headlight, the universe had dissolved into an endless, blinding wall of white. Victor had reduced the train's speed down to less than 15 miles per hour. At that low speed, reading the track ahead was nearly impossible. They were driving entirely by memory, instinct, and the mechanical feedback coming through the heavy iron controls. Then, without warning, a massive, frost-heavy pine tree, its branches weighed down by hundreds of pounds of solid ice, snapped under a powerful storm gust and crashed directly across the iron tracks just 40 feet ahead of the locomotive. Through the swirling snow, Victor caught a split-second glimpse of dark pine branches blocking the track. Instantly, his instincts took over. He pulled the heavy throttle back to zero and slammed the train's emergency air brake valve wide open. Under normal weather conditions, applying emergency brakes on an 8,000-ton freight train creates a violent deceleration. But at minus 52 degrees Fahrenheit, the mechanical physics were far more dangerous. The massive iron brake shoes slammed against the frozen steel wheels, creating a shower of blinding yellow sparks that illuminated the dark forest. The massive train shuddered, groaned, and slid across the frosted rails, coming to a sudden, violent halt just 6 feet from the fallen timber. Inside the cab, the sudden emergency stop threw Andre against the control console. But both men knew instantly that avoiding a collision with the tree was only the beginning of their nightmare. The real battle for survival had just begun. When a multi-thousand-ton freight train comes to a sudden emergency stop on a steep wilderness grade in extreme cold, a dangerous thermodynamic domino effect begins immediately. The sudden, rapid drop in compressed air pressure throughout the 2-kilometer brake line allowed remaining atmospheric moisture to freeze instantly inside the main air coupling of the 16th tank car behind the locomotive. That single frozen ice plug locked the heavy mechanical brakes on the rear half of the train completely solid. Worst of all, the train was now pinned on an upward 2% mountain grade, buried in deep snowdrifts, with its rear brakes frozen shut and a massive fallen tree blocking the iron rails directly ahead. Make no mistake, being stranded on a wilderness slope in a zero-visibility blizzard at -50, 2 degrees Fahrenheit is a life-or-death emergency. Here's the terrifying mechanical math that Victor and Andre faced in that moment. Because the train was stationary in 60-mile-per-hour winds, the fierce wind chill began rapidly stripping heat from the massive locomotive engine blocks. Normally, an idling diesel engine generates enough internal combustion heat to keep its cooling water warm. But in 60-mile-per-hour winds at 52 below zero, forced air convection was forcing cold air through the engine radiator shutters, cooling the engine block down at a dangerous rate. If the engine coolant temperature dropped below freezing, the diesel fuel in the tanks would turn to solid wax, the engine blocks would freeze and crack, and the primary electrical heating inside the cab would collapse completely. The math didn't lie. They had less than 90 minutes to clear the track obstruction, thaw the frozen brake line, and get the heavy train moving again before their iron locomotive transformed into a frozen tomb. Victor looked at his young assistant, his voice calm and authoritative over the roaring of the wind outside. "We do this step by step," he said. "First the brake line, then the tree. Keep your mask tight, don't touch bare metal, and do not lose hold of the safety line." Andre nodded, pulling his thick sheepskin cap down tightly over his ears and layering heavy wool gloves inside thick leather mittens. He strapped a heavy leather safety harness around his waist, clipping a thick, braided hemp safety line directly to the iron handrail running along the exterior of the locomotive. In zero-visibility whiteout conditions, stepping off a train car without a physical tether is a death sentence. A worker can wander just 10 feet into the blinding, swirling snow, lose all sense of direction, and freeze to death searching for the tracks. Andre opened the heavy iron cab door, and the extreme Arctic gale slammed into him like a physical wall. The icy air rushed into his lungs, making every breath feel like swallowing crushed glass. Stepping down onto the iron ladder, he lowered himself into 3 feet of fresh, powdery snow. The wind was so ferocious that it nearly knocked him off his feet, swirling blinding clouds of snow into his eyes. Holding his flashlight in one gloved hand and trailing the safety line with the other, Andre began the grueling, exhausting trudge back along the side of the stationary freight train. Every step required immense physical effort, lifting his heavy felt boots through dense drifts of crusted snow. He passed car after car, scanning the heavy iron brake rigging beneath the massive steel tank cars. The cold was so severe that his eyelashes began to freeze together, forced shut by his own condensation. He had to repeatedly squeeze his eyes shut to break the tiny ice crystals forming on his eyelids. Finally, 16 cars back from the engine, he found the source of the mechanical failure. The main iron air hose coupling between the cars was encased in a solid block of translucent blue ice. The drop in air pressure during the emergency stop had allowed trapped moisture to freeze the mechanical valve in the closed position, locking the rear brakes solid. Andre unbuckled his heavy tool bag, pulled out a small portable kerosene blowtorch, and ignited the burner under the shelter of his sheepskin coat to protect the small flame from the howling wind. Working with painstaking care, holding the torch with shaking, gloved hands, he directed the blue flame against the frozen iron coupling. He had to move the flame constantly, warming the heavy iron housing just enough to melt the internal ice plug without burning the rubber air seals inside the fitting. The heat of the flame created clouds of thick steam that instantly froze into white frost on his face mask. After 10 tense minutes of precise work, a loud mechanical hiss echoed through the dark forest as the ice plug melted, releasing the trapped air and unlocking the rear brakes. Meanwhile, at the front of the train, Victor was tackling the massive tree blocking the tracks. Working under the bright glare of the locomotive's high-intensity spotlight, he swung a heavy two-man timber axe into the frozen trunk of the fallen pine. At 52 degrees below zero, pine wood freezes so solid that it behaves like reinforced concrete. Every strike of the steel axe blade against the frozen wood sent shock waves ringing up Victor's arms, ringing out with a metallic ping that sounded like striking iron. As Andre returned from fixing the brake line, he grabbed the opposite end of a heavy two-man crosscut saw. Standing in hip-deep snow under the blinding beam of the headlight, the two men worked in perfect, rhythmic synchronization, sawing through the thick frozen trunk inch by inch. Physical exertion in extreme cold creates a deadly paradox for survival. As the body works harder, it produces sweat. But if sweat saturates a worker's inner cotton or wool clothing, that moisture instantly loses its insulating value the moment the physical exertion stops, leading to rapid, fatal hypothermia. Both men knew they had to maintain a steady, controlled physical pace, working hard enough to cut the heavy timber, but carefully managing their effort to prevent heavy sweating inside their winter gear. After 20 minutes of intense, synchronized labor, the thick pine trunk gave way with a loud crack. Using heavy iron pry bars, Victor and Andre levered the multi-ton frozen logs off the rails, pushing them down the steep, snowy embankment into the forest below. The iron tracks ahead were finally clear. Exhausted, their faces covered in thick white frost and their muscles screaming from effort, both men climbed back up the iron ladder into the locomotive cab, slamming the heavy iron door shut against the howling gale. Inside the cab, the air felt like a warm summer afternoon compared to the brutal wind outside. Andre collapsed into the assistant's seat, his hands trembling violently as the feeling slowly returned to his frozen fingers. Victor immediately poured 2 large tin cups of boiling black tea from the heavy metal kettle resting on the cab stove. They drank the hot tea in total silence, letting the scald of the hot liquid warm their core bodies from the inside out. As they drank, Victor kept a watchful eye on the engine temperature gauges. As it turned out, their quick action had saved the locomotive. The engine coolant temperature had hovered just 5 degrees above the critical freeze threshold, but with the airlines clear and the track open, they could now notch the throttle forward and generate real thermal energy again. Victor sat down in the main driver's seat, rested his gloved hand on the heavy iron throttle lever, and pulled it back toward his chest. Deep inside the locomotive engine room, the massive multi-thousand horsepower V16 diesel engine let out a deep, thunderous roar that echoed across the frozen valley. The heavy mechanical traction motors hummed as electrical power surged into the wheel axles. On the front of the locomotive, automated sanders activated, spraying dry, coarse river sand directly onto the frost-covered iron rails just ahead of the driving wheels. The heavy steel wheels bit into the sand, finding traction on the slick, frozen surface. Slowly, inch by inch, the 6,000-ton freight train began to move forward. The iron couplings between the heavy freight cars clanked and groaned in sequence down the 2-kilometer line as 8,000 tons of rolling steel broke free from the snowdrifts and began climbing the mountain grade once again. By 6 o'clock in the morning, as the train reached the summit of the high mountain pass, the ferocious Arctic blizzard began to break. The thick storm clouds parted overhead, revealing a brilliant, crystalline night sky packed with millions of sharp stars. To the north, giant curtains of green and violet northern lights began to dance across the sky, casting a surreal, radiant glow across the vast, snow-covered landscape stretching out for 100 miles in every direction. As the sun began to peek over the eastern horizon, the bitter sky turned magnificent shades of deep pink and violet. The vast Siberian forest below, buried under 4 feet of pristine snow, sparkled like a field of crushed diamonds under the rising sun. Inside the quiet, warm cab, The steady, rhythmic clatter of the steel wheels resumed its endless lullaby. Tatum, tatum, tatum. Andre leaned back against his seat, watching the magnificent pink sunrise wash over the snow-capped mountain peaks ahead. His hands had stopped shaking, the cab heater was humming softly, and the heavy train was rolling smoothly down the long mountain descent toward the next division station. They had survived the ultimate test of the Arctic frontier. They had battled 52 below zero temperatures, gale-force winds, frozen brake lines, and fallen timber in complete pitch darkness, guided only by mechanical discipline, mutual trust, and centuries of hard-won survival wisdom. They called him crazy for taking on such a brutal job, but as Andre looked out over the glowing, untouched wilderness stretching to the edge of the earth, he understood why men stayed on these remote iron lines for a lifetime. When you look at a map of northern Asia, you see a thin iron line stretching nearly 9,000 kilometers across 5 time zones, cutting through some of the most unforgiving terrain on the face of the earth. To the untrained eye, it appears to be simple transportation infrastructure. But during the deep winter, that line is something far more extraordinary. It is a continuous, living arterial system that keeps entire civilization outposts alive against impossible odds. Major northern cities, industrial mining centers, and isolated power stations depend entirely on the steady, uninterrupted flow of heavy freight traveling down these tracks. Millions of tons of coal to keep municipal power plants running, millions of gallons of heating oil, fresh food supplies, heavy machinery, and raw industrial materials move continuously down this corridor every single day. If these trains stopped running for even 72 hours during a prolonged Arctic deep freeze, municipal heating systems in remote cities would freeze solid. Water mains would burst inside subterranean streets, and entire communities of tens of thousands of people would be forced to evacuate or face catastrophic cold. The true legacy of these Arctic rail operations lies not merely in the heavy steel locomotives or the sheer tonnage of freight moved, but in the quiet, unyielding discipline of the men and women who keep the system moving through conditions that keep everyone else indoors. Truth be told, the engineering principles forged on these northern iron lines laid the groundwork for modern cold-weather transport across the globe. From the oil fields of northern Alaska to the ice roads of the Canadian Yukon, heavy industrial operators still rely on the exact same thermodynamic principles perfected decades ago in the Siberian taiga. Let us examine the hard physical data and thermal mechanics that make this extreme logistics operation possible. The numbers behind winter railroading tell a fascinating story of resource efficiency and physical adaptation. Consider the energy balance of continuous locomotive idling. A heavy 3-section Arctic diesel locomotive consumes approximately 2 to 3 gallons of diesel fuel per hour while sitting at low idle. Over a 24-hour period, an idling engine burns around 60 to 70 gallons of fuel simply to maintain internal operating temperatures. To someone unfamiliar with Arctic engineering, leaving a massive engine idling for weeks at a time seems like an enormous waste of fuel. But the math didn't lie. If that same locomotive engine were shut down in minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit weather and allowed to go cold, bringing it back to operational temperature requires over 30 hours of continuous external heating using high-capacity kerosene flame blowers. That warming process consumes over 200 gallons of fuel, requires a 4-man maintenance crew working in shifts, and subjects internal engine components to severe thermal stress that can cause microfractures in cast iron cylinder heads. By maintaining continuous combustion, the engine operates as its own self-contained thermal power plant. Over 75% of the thermal energy produced during low idling is captured by onboard heat exchangers and routed directly into the cab radiators, air system evaporators, and main fuel tanks. The thermal retention performance of the insulated locomotive cab is equally impressive. Under lab testing and field measurements, a double-cased, mineral wool insulated steel cab maintains an internal temperature of 65 degrees Fahrenheit while consuming less than 8% of the engine's auxiliary electrical output, even when outside temperatures drop to 52 below zero, with headwind speeds exceeding 40 miles per hour. Ground stabilization physics show a similar pattern of engineering success. Along permafrost sectors, protected by liquid ammonia thermosiphons, soil temperature measurements recorded over a 30-year period revealed that subterranean ground temperatures remain stabilized at a constant 12 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. This passive refrigeration technique reduced seasonal embankment, settling by over 85% compared to uninsulated track beds, preventing thousands of potential train derailments and saving millions of dollars in continuous track realignment work. Fuel management statistics demonstrate the critical importance of preheating loops. By routing hot engine coolant through internal fuel tank heat exchangers, Arctic locomotives maintain fuel temperatures at a stable 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. This prevents paraffin wax crystallization and maintains optimal fuel viscosity, allowing fuel injectors to operate at 99% efficiency regardless of ambient weather conditions outside. In the end, however, mechanical data and thermodynamic calculations tell only half the story. The ultimate lesson of the northern frontier is a lesson in human resilience and profound respect for nature. At -40 degrees Fahrenheit, nature does not negotiate, compromise, or offer second chances. It does not care about schedules, shipping deadlines, or human comfort. Out in the vast, quiet wilderness, arrogance is rewarded with instant failure, while humility, discipline, and absolute preparation are rewarded with survival. The men who drive these trains do not view themselves as legendary heroes fighting against the elements. If you ask them, they will tell you they are simply workers doing a job that needs to be done. They survive because they respect their machinery, trust their partners, and follow operating rules that were written in sweat and iron by generations of railroaders who came before them. They understand that their locomotive cab is a tiny sanctuary of life sliding through an ocean of darkness, and that as long as the engine rumbles, the tea kettle boils, and the headlight cuts through the falling snow, they can overcome any storm the frontier throws their way. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey into the heart of extreme Arctic engineering and frontier survival. Stories like these remind us of the incredible ingenuity, mechanical grit, and quiet courage that human beings display when tested by the most challenging environments on Earth. If you enjoyed this long-form documentary, please take a moment to click that like button and share this video with fellow history and engineering enthusiasts. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and click the notification bell so you never miss an episode on our channel. We want to hear from you. Could you handle spending 3 days in a locomotive cab at -40 degrees Fahrenheit, 200 kilometers from the nearest town? Drop your thoughts, questions, and experiences in the comments below because we read every single one. Until next time, stay safe, respect the elements, keep your fires burning bright, and we will see you further down the line. The historical accounts, technical specifications, and mechanical procedures described in this presentation are intended strictly for educational, historical, and documentary entertainment purposes. Operating heavy railway machinery and surviving in extreme sub-zero wilderness conditions require specialized professional training, professional-grade equipment, and strict adherence to official transportation safety regulations. Do not attempt to operate industrial equipment or enter extreme weather environments without proper authorization, expert instruction, and complete emergency support systems.